June 1944. The claustrophobic green hell of the Normandy bocage. An 8-ounce strand of simple telephone wire is about to paralyze 56 tons of German steel. This isn't fiction. This isn't a Hollywood script. This is the declassified, almost unbelievable story of how one engineer's desperate, absurd idea halted the most feared weapon of the Second World War in less than 3 seconds. To understand how this happened, you first have to understand the monster. You have to understand the Tiger, the Panzerkampfwagen 66, Tiger Ausf. E. Even its name was an act of psychological warfare. When the Tiger I first appeared, it shattered Allied and Soviet confidence. It was not a tank, it was a fortress. A 56-ton Predator designed for a single purpose: to dominate. Its development began in 1941, born from the shock of encountering the Soviet T-34 and KV-1 German engineers at Henschel and Porsche were ordered to create a heavy tank that was untouchable. And they succeeded. When production began in August 1942, it was the single most sophisticated and lethal ground weapon on Earth. Let's talk about the armor. The front of the hull was 100 millimeters of solid, face-hardened steel. The turret front, 120 millimeters. Its side armor was 80 millimeters thick. To an American Sherman crew, these numbers were a death sentence. The Sherman's standard 75 millimeter gun could not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. At any range, not at 1,000 meters, not at 500 meters, not at point-blank range, every round would simply bounce. Allied crews developed a terrifying mathematics of survival. It was estimated that to guarantee a single Tiger kill, you had to be willing to lose 5 Shermans. 5. Think about that. Think about being the crew in the first, second, third, or fourth tank, knowing your job was simply to die, so that the 5th tank might get a lucky shot into the Tiger's thinner rear armor. Allied tankers called engaging a Tiger at range a suicide mission. They were ordered to avoid it at all costs, to run, to hide, to call for air support that might never come. This created a Tiger phobia that crippled entire divisions. And then there was the gun. The Tiger was built around the legendary 88mm KWK-36 cannon. This wasn't just a tank gun. It was a modified version of the dreaded Flak 88 anti-aircraft gun, already famous for tearing Allied bombers from the sky and annihilating British tanks in North Africa. Mounted in the Tiger, it was a sniper rifle. It could punch through 4 inches of sloped armor at 1,000 meters. A Sherman's frontal armor? It could penetrate that from 2,000 meters away. That's over a mile. The Tiger crew could stop, spot an Allied column, and destroy 5 Shermans before the Americans even knew they were in range. The Tiger was safe. The Allies were helpless. Each Tiger was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. Each one cost over 650,000 Reichsmarks. Each one demanded 300,000 man-hours to build. Germany couldn't afford to lose them. The Allies couldn't afford to face them. The tank was powered by a Maybach HL-230 P45 5Pa12 engine, generating 700 horsepower. It could rotate its massive turret a full 360 degrees in under a minute. It could climb a 35-degree slope. It could ford rivers 4 feet deep. It was, in every sense, invincible. Or was it? Every legend has a secret. Every monster has a vulnerability. And the Tiger's was beautiful. The Germans called it the Laufwerk, the running gear. Look at a picture of a Sherman tank. You see simple vertical wheels, easy to build, easy to replace. Now look at a Tiger. It's different. It's a complex, interleaved, overlapping system of road wheels. 9 road wheels per side, overlapping in 3 distinct rows. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, brilliant piece of German engineering. Why do this? Weight distribution, To stop the 56-ton tank from sinking into soft ground, the engineers needed to distribute that immense weight over the widest possible track area. The overlapping pattern distributed the stress perfectly. It gave the Tiger a ground pressure of just 14.8 pounds per square inch, lower than many lighter tanks, including the Sherman. This meant the Tiger could traverse soft, muddy ground that would bog down simpler designs. It also gave the crew an incredibly smooth ride, which improved gun accuracy while moving. In theory, it was perfect in the field. It was a maintenance nightmare. This exquisite complexity was the Tiger's Achilles heel. Think about those overlapping wheels. What happens when the tank drives through mud? The mud gets trapped. On the Eastern Front, Tiger crews faced a daily hell. The gaps between the wheels would fill with thick Russian mud, which would then freeze solid overnight. The tracks would be locked, the tank completely immobilized. Crews spent hours every single morning, under threat of sniper fire, desperately trying to chip frozen blocks of earth from the running gear with crowbars and blowtorches. In the desert, it was sand. The grit would grind down the rubber tire rings that cushioned each wheel, shattering the suspension. And then there was the repair, to change a single inner road wheel on a Tiger. A crew had to first remove up to 8 of the outer wheels. What took a Sherman crew 20 minutes with basic tools took a Tiger crew half a day, if they had a specialized heavy crane nearby. This complexity had catastrophic costs. More friction, more points of failure, more opportunities for debris to lodge in the mechanism. It was a system designed for a perfect world, not for the blood and mud of a total war. And 4 days after landing on Omaha Beach, a 23-year-old electrician from Pittsburgh noticed. His name was Corporal James Mallister. He was not an armor expert. He was a combat engineer with the 1st Infantry Division. His unit had been tasked with clearing roadblocks outside the shattered town of Margles. And there, he saw it, a Tiger I abandoned, its engine dead from fuel starvation. Mallister had seen a Tiger exactly once. He climbed onto the cold hull. He touched the armor. He studied the tracks. He counted the wheels. He measured the gaps with his hands. He noticed what the tank's designers, in their quest for perfection, had overlooked. The overlapping wheels created narrow channels between their edges, tight, vertical spaces where the wheels nearly touched, but didn't. Each gap was perhaps 3 inches wide, just enough for the wheels to rotate, but just narrow enough to trap objects of a certain dimension. He saw evidence. A single stone, wedged between 2 wheels, had cracked the rubber tire on one of them. A piece of chain, caught in the drive sprocket, had torn 3 track links before the crew managed to cut it free. Mallister, the electrician, understood systems. He understood tension. He ran his fingers along the massive track assembly. Each link weighed 11 pounds. The entire track assembly on one side weighed nearly 2,000 pounds. Once that mass was moving, it generated enormous momentum. It resisted stopping, but Mallister realized if something did jam that mechanism, that same unstoppable momentum would amplify the damage. It would tear the machine apart from the inside. Before the driver could even react, he filed the observation away. A curiosity, a footnote in a long, brutal day. 3 weeks later, his company was dug in along a hedge south of Carentan, and his curiosity, suicidal, was about to become the only thing standing between 32 men and annihilation. The terrain was the bocage, the hedgerows of Normandy, older than the war, older than nations. They were not bushes. They were massive earth and stone berms, 4 feet high, topped with ancient thorny brambles. They divided the countryside into a claustrophobic maze. Each field was a fortress, each gap in the hedge a killing ground. The bocage turned the war of rapid maneuver into a grinding, brutal attrition. Infantry advanced by the meter. Tanks became blind. their guns unable to traverse. The Americans had trained for open fields. They had trained for beach assaults. They had not trained for this. The hedgerows negated every Allied advantage. Armor couldn't move. Air support couldn't see targets through the thick canopy. But the Germans understood this terrain. They had 4 years to prepare. Every crossroads was pre-registered for mortar fire. Every gap was covered by interlocking MG-42 machine guns. The Germans didn't need to win. They just needed to delay. Every day the Allies spent bleeding in the bocage was another day to reinforce the interior, another day to move the panzer divisions, another day to fortify the roads to St. Lo. Mallister's platoon had been on the line for 18 days. They had advanced 2 miles. They had lost 11 men. The replacements were green. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit. They didn't know the sound of a German mortar. They froze when the machine guns opened up. Mallister and the other veterans taught them. Dig deeper. Stay lower. Move faster. Most learned. Some didn't live long enough. June 28th. 05:30 hours. The Germans counterattacked. Not a probe. Not a patrol. A full-strength armored thrust. Panzer grenadiers. Half-tracks and rolling at the spearhead. 4 Tiger tanks from the 101st Heavy Panzer Battalion. Intelligence had warned they were in the sector, but knowing they were present and facing them were 2 very different experiences. The intel reports didn't convey the sound. Mallister heard them before he saw them. The deep guttural growl of the Maybach engines, the metallic clank of tracks on cobblestone. The ground itself trembled. His platoon was dug in along a sunken road, running perpendicular to the German advance. 32 men, 2 bazookas, 3 Springfield rifles per foxhole. The orders were simple. Hold until relieved, or overrun. No one expected them to stop 4 Tigers. The mission was to delay, to buy time for artillery, to force the Germans to deploy. If the platoon held for 30 minutes, it would be a success. Survival was optional during 615 hours. The Tigers appeared, 4 gray monstrous shapes emerging from the morning mist. Their turrets traversed slowly. Their long 88mm guns were elevated, ready to fire high-explosive rounds into the hedgerows. They were coming, and nothing on earth could stop them. The lead tank was 200 meters out when it fired. The shell hit a farmhouse to Mallister's left. Stone and timber exploded into fragments. The concussion knocked dust from the hedge. The second Tiger fired, then the third. This was suppressive fire. It was designed to keep American heads down while the German infantry advanced beside them. The sound was distinctive. The 88mm KB-36 gun had a flat, sharp, cracking report. It wasn't the booming roar of American artillery. It was something harder, more percussive. Each shot was followed by the whistle of the shell in flight, then the crack of impact. They were firing high-explosive rounds, not armor-piercing. The Tigers weren't hunting tanks. They were clearing infantry. They didn't even consider Mallister's platoon a threat. They considered it a nuisance. The tactics were methodical. Shell the hedgerow. Advance 50 meters. Shell again. Let their infantry sweep the position. Move to the next objective. It was a meat grinder. Mallister looked at the 2 bazooka teams huddled in their foxholes. They were the platoon's only anti-tank defense, and they were useless. Mallister knew the math. The M1 bazooka could, under ideal conditions, penetrate 3 inches of armor. The effective range was 100 meters. Beyond that, the shaped charge rocket's accuracy was terrible. The Tiger's frontal armor was 4 inches thick, hardened, angled. Even a perfect hit at point-blank range would likely just bounce off or shatter, alerting the crew to your exact location. The only vulnerable points were the engine deck and the lower rear hull. To hit those, you had to let the 56-ton monster pass you. You had to let it roll over your position, then rise up behind it and fire at a machine designed to kill you. None of Mallister's men were going to get that chance. The Tigers would shell the hedgerow to rubble. Then their machine guns would finish off any survivors. It was standard doctrine. It was proven tactics. The Germans had done it 1,000 times in Russia, against troops more experienced than this American platoon. They'd do it here, and it would work. Mallister looked at the sunken road. It was 15 feet wide, hard-packed dirt, with ruts from farm carts. It was the only route through this section of Bocage that could support a tiger's weight. The hedgerows on either side were too dense, the earth too soft. Engineers had checked 3 days earlier. Anything heavier than a half-track would bog down within 20 feet. The tanks had to come down this road, single file, at walking speed, blind to their flanks. This was where the platoon was supposed to make its stand. 2 bazookas, positioned to fire on the engine decks as the Tigers passed. Infantry with grenades to try and attack the vision ports. It was a forlorn hope. Desperation tactics. Mallister had watched crews train with the bazooka. It was a good weapon against the side of a Panzer IV. It was marginal against a Panther. It was suicide against a Tiger. He looked at his hands. He was still holding the coil of communications wire. 300 feet of braided steel cable. Standard field telephone wire, 1/8 of an inch thick. Tensile strength rated for 200 pounds. Nowhere near strong enough to stop a tank. You could wrap it around a Tiger's gun barrel and the tank wouldn't even notice. You could drape it across the hull and the crew would brush it off. Wire was for communications, not for combat, but that wasn't what he needed it to do. He remembered the abandoned Tiger, the cold steel, the gaps between the wheels, the cracked rubber from a single jammed stone, the 2,000-pound track assembly, the momentum. The idea was absurd. A single strand of wire against 56 tons of armor. It violated every principle of anti-tank warfare. Mines worked through explosive force. Bazookas worked through shaped charge penetration. Artillery worked through kinetic energy and overpressure. Wire had none of these. It was a nuisance, a delay, something to be brushed aside. But wire could jam. That was the theory. If the wire caught in those overlapping wheels, if the angle was right, if the tension held, it might just jam the mechanism. Lock the track! Immobilize the tank. It was a slim chance, an impossible chance. But the alternative was watching 4 Tigers roll through the platoon's position and kill everyone in the hedgerow. The alternative was certain death. Mallister ran. He sprinted 50 meters down the sunken road, staying low in the depression where the Tiger gunners couldn't see him. The road curved slightly, creating a blind spot. He found what he needed. 2 stout fence posts on opposite sides of the road. Weathered oak, driven deep for a gate that no longer existed. The posts were solid enough. He tied one end of the wire to the left post. He wrapped it 3 times around. He used a triple fisherman's knot, something his father had taught him for securing electrical conduit, a knot that wouldn't slip under load. He pulled the wire across the road. He kept it taut, ankle height, maybe 8 inches off the ground, low enough to catch the Tiger's running gear, high enough not to drag in the dirt. He tied the other end to the right post. Same technique, 3 wraps, maximum tension. The wire was taut enough to hum when he plucked it. It was almost invisible in the early morning shadow of the hedge. He had 90 seconds before the lead Tiger reached his position. Mallister scrambled back to his foxhole. He told no one what he'd done. There was no time to explain. There was no certainty it would work. He just waited. The lead Tiger entered the sunken road at 0620. It moved at walking speed, 4 kilometers an hour. The engine was throttled down to reduce fuel consumption. The commander's hatch was open. An officer in a black Panzer uniform stood half-exposed, scanning for threats. This was standard operating procedure in close terrain. The closed hatches reduced visibility to dangerous levels. Better to risk small arms fire than blunder into an ambush. The main gun was traversed left, covering the hedgerow where Mallister's platoon was hidden. The coaxial machine gun was manned, ready to rake the tree line. The tank was 20 meters from the wire. Meters. Mallister held his breath. The front left drive sprocket hit the wire. Physics took over. The wire didn't break. The fence posts held. The cable was thinner than the gap between the Tiger's overlapping road wheels, but the angle was wrong. Instead of slipping through, the wire caught on the bottom edge of the third road wheel. The forward momentum of the tank pulled the wire upward and inward. It wrapped around the wheel in a fraction of a second. 1 loop, 2 loops, 3. The interleaved wheels, the Tiger's brilliant, complex design, created a self-feeding trap. As the wheel rotated, it drew more wire into the mechanism. The wire jammed between the second and third wheels. It happened faster than the driver could react. The wire wedged into the narrow gap. The rubber tire on the second wheel compressed against the wire. The third wheel pulled from the opposite direction. The wire bit into the rubber. It found purchase. The tension increased exponentially. 200 pounds of tensile strength multiplied by the mechanical advantage of the rotating wheels. The wire acted like a ratchet. Each rotation drew it tighter. The wheels locked together. The entire left side track assembly seized. The right track kept moving. The Tiger pivoted violently to the left. The driver felt the loss of control through the steering levers. He reacted instinctively. He gunned the engine. Wrong decision. The Maybach roared. 700 horsepower tried to drag the locked track forward. The right track dug into the road surface, throwing up dirt. The Tiger slew sideways. The locked left track acted like a pivot point. The tank rotated 15 degrees in 2 seconds. Something in the Laufwerk snapped. Not the wire. The wire held. It was a suspension arm that failed first. The torsion bar connecting the third road wheel to the hull fractured under the uneven load. Then a mounting bracket. The Tiger lurched and stopped. The engine screamed. Black smoke poured from the exhaust as the governor tried to compensate for the sudden, impossible load. The driver killed the engine before it damaged itself further. Total elapsed time: 2.8 seconds. The Tiger sat motionless in the sunken road, canted at a 15-degree angle to the left, blocking the advance of the 3 tanks behind it. The commander stood in his hatch. He looked back. He looked forward. He screamed into his radio. Mallister didn't speak German, but he understood panic when he heard it. The tone, the urgency. The commander was reporting that his tank was immobilized. Cause unknown. Track damaged. Blocking the road. He needed engineers. He needed recovery equipment. He needed the formation to halt. The Germans were trapped. The road was too narrow for the tanks behind him to reverse and turn around, and they couldn't bypass the lead tank. The hedgerows on either side were 4-foot earth berms. The ground beyond was soft. A 56-ton Tiger attempting to climb the berm would either bog down or throw a track. Either outcome would immobilize a second tank. They couldn't abandon the vehicle. Doctrine prohibited leaving operational armor to the enemy. They were trapped. 4 Tigers in a linear formation, on a single road, with American infantry dug in on both flanks. It was the nightmare scenario German armor doctrine was designed to prevent. Tanks without infantry support, enclosed terrain, unable to maneuver, sitting targets. The commander of the second Tiger tried to push the lead tank clear. He closed to within 5 meters, lowered his blade, and revved his engine. The plan was to shove the disabled Tiger forward enough to create a gap, maybe push it off the road entirely. The second Tiger's engine roared. Its tracks spun, tore up the road surface, through debris. The disabled tank didn't budge. Its locked left track acted like an anchor. The weight of the hull pressed down through the seized mechanism. 56 tons distributed across 8 road wheels. The friction was enormous. After 30 seconds, the tracks on the second Tiger began to slip. Rubber tire rings smoked. The commander gave up before he damaged his own vehicle. The Germans were now stationary targets. In a known location, Mallister's lieutenant was already on the radio. Fire mission called in at 0626. Coordinates transmitted. Adjust fire. 3 batteries of 105mm howitzers acknowledged. Tubes elevated. Propellant charges loaded. High explosive shells. Variable time fuses set for airburst. The trap was set. The bait was taken. And now, the real hunters were on their way. The target was not the Tigers themselves. American artillery couldn't penetrate a Tiger's top armor from that distance. The target was the infantry supporting the tanks. The first shells, set for airburst, impacted at 0630. They didn't explode on the ground. They exploded 20 feet above the hedgerows, spraying thousands of red-hot steel fragments downward in a cone of death. White phosphorus ignited the dry vegetation, creating a suffocating, burning smoke. For the Panzer Grenadiers hiding in the hedges, it was a slaughter. There was no cover from an attack that came from above. They broke. They scattered. Some tried to stay with the tanks, taking cover behind the massive hulls, only to be torn apart by the next salvo. Others fled back down the road, abandoning the armor. Within 2 minutes, the Tigers were alone. Without infantry, they were blind and vulnerable. Their powerful 80mm guns were useless against a target they couldn't see. The crew-served machine guns couldn't depress low enough to engage targets at the base of the hulls. A single, determined infantryman with a satchel charge could now approach from dead ground and destroy a multi-million Reichsmark machine. The Tigers were worth more than the men supporting them. That was the cold mathematics of German armor doctrine in 1944. Trained tankers were irreplaceable. Each Tiger represented a strategic asset. Losing a tank was a strategic blow. Losing infantry was a tactical inconvenience. But now, the irreplaceable asset was stuck, and the American forces were not going to let this opportunity pass. 22 Sherman platoon arrived at 0645. 4 M4A1 tanks. But these were not the old Shermans with the 75mm pop guns that bounced off Tiger armor. These were new. They carried the 76mm high-velocity gun. Longer barrels, higher muzzle velocity, a weapon capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor at 500 meters. The Sherman commanders knew the Tigers' location. They knew they were immobilized, and they knew the German infantry had scattered. They didn't engage the lead Tiger. They didn't drive into the same trap. They bypassed it. They maneuvered through gaps in the bocage that the Tigers couldn't navigate. Lighter tanks? Simpler suspension. Narrower tracks. They used the terrain, the very terrain that had been a green hell for their own infantry, as a weapon against the Tigers' over-engineered perfection. They reached firing. Positions 300 meters behind the German formation, the Tigers were facing the wrong direction. Their turrets could traverse, but slowly. 62 seconds for a full 360-degree rotation. The Shermans had 30 seconds to fire before the Tigers could bring their main guns to bear. At 0650, all 4 Shermans fired simultaneously. They didn't target the frontal armor. They didn't even target the side plates. They targeted the rearmost Tiger's engine deck, the thinnest armor on the entire vehicle. 25 millimeters, angled but not steeply enough. 3 76mm armor-piercing shells penetrated. They punched through the thin steel deck and into the engine compartment. One struck the fuel tanks. The Tiger erupted, not a Hollywood explosion. A rapid, violent expansion of burning fuel and smoke. Flames poured from the engine grills, thick, black smoke from burning rubber and oil. The crew had 15 seconds to evacuate before the ammunition cooked off. 5 men emerged, 3 from the turret hatches, 2 from the hull. 2 of them were on fire. They rolled in the dirt, screaming. The remaining Tigers surrendered at 700. Crews emerged, hands raised high. white undershirts tied to their radio antennas. The mathematics had shifted. 3 tigers, trapped on a narrow road. American armor behind them. American artillery zeroed in on their position. American infantry closing in from the flanks. No infantry support. No way to maneuver. No way to win. Surrender was the only rational choice. Live to be exchanged or repatriated. Better than burning to death inside a 56-ton steel coffin. The disabled lead Tiger, Mallister's Tiger, was towed to a field workshop for analysis. American engineers swarmed over it. They photographed every detail. They measured the armor thickness. They examined the running gear, and they found the wire. It was still wrapped around the road wheels. They needed cutting torches to remove it. The wire had bitten so deeply into the rubber tires that it had scored the steel underneath. The autopsy was clinical. The suspension arm was fractured. The torsion bar was cracked. The mounting bracket was bent. Total repair time, 12 hours. The parts were available from captured stocks. The Tiger was operational again by evening, but it never returned to combat. Fuel shortages kept it immobilized for the rest of the campaign. By August, it sat in a depot south of St. Lo, awaiting fuel that never arrived. In September, the crew was reassigned. In October, advancing American units captured the depot. The Tiger was loaded onto a flatbed and shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. For evaluation, Mallister's commanding officer submitted him for a Bronze Star. The citation was brief. Bureaucratic language for innovative action resulting in the neutralization of enemy armor. The paperwork traveled up the chain of command. Battalion, regiment, division. The medal was approved in August. It was presented in September at a formation in a muddy field outside Aachen. And then James Mallister went back to work. After the war, he returned to Pittsburgh. He used the GI Bill to finish an engineering degree. He worked as an electrician for 31 years, a union man, steady employment. He married in 1947. He had 3 children. He retired in 1976. He died in 1989 from complications of lung cancer. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned his military service in one sentence. Bronze Star recipient, combat engineer, Normandy to the Elbe. The obituary said nothing about the wire, nothing about the Tiger. His family knew he'd been in the war. They didn't know the details, but word spread. Among combat engineers, the story became a legend. After-action reports circulated. The wire trick appeared in intelligence summaries. Field manuals were updated. By July 1944, engineer companies across the European theater were carrying extra coils of wire. Not for communications, for traps. Some tried to replicate Mallister's success. The results were mixed. The wire worked against tigers and panthers when conditions aligned. Narrow roads, firm anchors, surprise, the right angle of approach, but it failed against lighter tanks with simpler running gear. It failed in mud, where the wire sank before the tank reached it. It failed when tank crews learned to watch for it. German field manuals were updated in August. Warnings about cable traps appeared in technical bulletins distributed to panzer units. Crews were ordered to have one man walk ahead of the formation in close terrain, to cut any suspicious wires, to machine gun the base of hedgerows before advancing. The countermeasures were effective. By September, the wire trick rarely worked. The tactical window was brief, June to August 1944, 3 months. But its impact was documented. At least 11 Tiger and Panther tanks were immobilized by wire traps during that period. Not destroyed, not captured, just stopped, forced to halt in exposed positions where they could be flanked or bypassed or destroyed by indirect fire. In the mathematics of armored warfare, a stopped tank was often as valuable as a dead one. It blocked roads, it consumed resources, it required recovery. It tied up engineers and mechanics, and the Tiger itself represented Germany's strategic dilemma. It was over-engineered, expensive, maintenance-intensive. It was tactically dominant, but strategically irrelevant. Germany produced 1,084 Tiger Wagens on tanks between 1942 and 1944. In that same period, the Soviet Union produced 57,000 tons T-34s. The United States built 49,000. Sherman's quality could not compensate. For quantity at that scale, every Tiger destroyed was irreplaceable. Every Tiger stopped was a resource wasted. Every hour spent repairing one Tiger was an hour not spent repairing 3 Panthers or 6 Panzer IVs. The interleaved wheel design, the Laufwerk that made the Tiger so capable, was its downfall. It was optimal engineering for ideal conditions. It was catastrophic in the field. The overlapping wheels distributed weight beautifully when clean and maintained. They jammed catastrophically when fouled. The design required peace to function properly. It needed smooth terrain, dry conditions, and regular maintenance. War provided none of these. The bocage was mud and wire and debris. The Eastern Front was frozen mud in winter, liquid mud in spring. North Africa was sand and grit. Every single environment exposed the Tiger's vulnerability. The wire trap exposed a deeper truth about complex systems. They fail in simple ways. The more sophisticated the design, the more fragile it becomes. The Tiger's interleaved wheels were optimal for weight distribution. They created vulnerabilities that simpler designs avoided. The Sherman's vertical volute suspension was crude by comparison. 5 road wheels per side, no overlap, no interleave, just coil springs and shock absorbers. It provided a rougher ride. It created higher ground pressure, but it was also modular, repairable, resistant to fouling. A Sherman crew could replace a road wheel in 20 minutes. With basic tools, a Tiger crew needed half a day and specialized equipment to change an inner wheel. This principle extended beyond armor. Theater Luftwaffe's Me-262 jet fighter was 100 miles per hour, faster than anything the Allies fielded. But its engines lasted 12 hours before needing replacement, and it required smooth, concrete runways that Allied bombers destroyed nightly. Germany's V-2 rocket was a technical marvel. It also cost as much as a 4-engine bomber and delivered a 1-ton warhead with poor accuracy. Germany's wonder weapons were marvels of engineering, and studies in impracticality. They won battles. They lost wars. They demonstrated technical superiority and strategic bankruptcy. They proved that sophistication without sustainability is a path to defeat. The Allies won with simpler weapons, produced in overwhelming numbers. The Sherman was inferior to the Tiger in direct combat, but America built 50 Shermans for every Tiger Germany produced. Mallister understood none of this. He wasn't a strategic analyst. He was an electrician who knew how machines failed. He saw a gap in the wheels and thought about jamming it. There was no grand strategy, no sophisticated analysis, no deep understanding of German engineering philosophy. Just a man with 300 feet of wire and 90 seconds to act. Just the desperate calculation that anything was worth trying. If the alternative was certain death, that was enough. The war didn't turn on wire traps. It turned on logistics, industrial capacity, and mathematics. But individual actions mattered in local contexts. A disabled Tiger saved 32 lives in one hedgerow, and the wire trap endures. It appears in training manuals at Fort Moore, case studies at the Army Engineer School, academic papers on improvised anti-tank measures. It represents something essential about warfare that transcends technology. Complexity creates fragility. Ingenuity finds weakness. Desperation breeds innovation. Mallister never claimed to be innovative. In his only recorded interview, given in 1987 To a local newspaper researching veteran stories, he said, "I just didn't want to die that morning. The wire was in my hand. The posts were right there. It seemed worth trying. I didn't think it would work, but doing nothing definitely wasn't going to work." Worth trying. Two words that summarize battlefield innovation across centuries. Most attempts fail. A few succeed. The successful ones get remembered, analyzed, mythologized. The failures vanish into the noise of combat. The difference is often luck. If Mallister's wire had been 6 inches higher, the Tiger would have driven under it. If the posts had been rotten, they would have snapped. If the commander had been more cautious, he would have sent infantry ahead, but the variables aligned. The wire held. The trap jammed. The formation halted. The Shermans flanked. The Germans surrendered. Mallister survived. The Tiger. I was retired from production in August 1944. Germany shifted resources to the Tiger II, which had even thicker armor and even more complex mechanics. It also had overlapping wheels. The vulnerabilities remained. Modern armor designers remember this. Contemporary main battle tanks use fewer, larger road wheels. 6 per side on the M1 Abrams, 7 on the Leopard 2. Simplified. Suspension systems that prioritize maintainability over optimal ride quality. The lessons learned from the Tigers. Failures were incorporated into every tank design. Since elegance is valuable, reliability is essential. Complexity without robustness is a liability. June 1944 taught that lesson in blood and steel. Mallister taught it with wire and 90 seconds of courage. Mallister's wire is preserved today. The Infantry Museum at Fort Moore, Georgia, houses it in a climate-controlled case. It's displayed with a typed card explaining its use. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. The wire looks unremarkable. Frayed steel cable, rust spots, faded green fabric insulation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that suggests its significance. But it stopped a machine designed to be unstoppable. It proved that 56 tons of armor, 4 inches of hardened steel, and 700 horsepower could be defeated by 8 ounces of wire applied at the right point with the right timing. It demonstrated that every system, no matter how sophisticated, has vulnerabilities. The lesson isn't about wire. It's about seeing systems as they are, not as they're intended to be. The Tiger was intended to dominate, but it was also a collection of components under stress. Wheels and tracks and pins and brackets. Each one a potential failure point. Mallister didn't attack the Tiger's strengths. He targeted a seam in its complexity. He found the point where sophistication became vulnerability. Declassified. Bastogne, 1944. A corporal in a frozen foxhole hears a secret. Through a captured German radio, a panzer commander gives coordinates. Not to his tanks, to American positions. 300 GIs are sleeping 2 miles away, right in the kill zone. Eddie Voss has 1 second to make an impossible choice. Obey his direct orders and let 300 men be annihilated? Or commit a court-martial offense and become the enemy? Eddie keys the mic and speaks perfect, unauthorized German into the void. This is the forbidden story of the one radio call that saved a battalion, and why the United States Army tried to bury the truth forever. Before we dive in, if you believe the most important wartime stories are the ones that were never supposed to be told, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You will not find these stories anywhere else. To understand how Eddie Voss could hold 300 lives in his hand, you first have to understand the chaos of December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't a battle. It was a shattering Hitler's last desperate gamble. He had thrown 250,000 men and over 1,000 armored vehicles into the Ardennes forest, a sector the Allies believed was quiet. The American lines didn't bend. They snapped. Entire divisions were encircled. Regiments were cut off, their command structures vaporized, and in this frozen hell, the single most critical asset wasn't bullets or food or even warmth. It was communication, and communication was dead. The U.S. Army Signal Corps was in a state of panic. Radio operators, meant to relay simple messages up the chain, were suddenly isolated. Their equipment was failing in the sub-zero temperatures. Batteries died in hours, not days, and the airwaves were a screaming cacophony of jammed frequencies, desperate calls for help, and German. The Germans were advancing so fast, their communications were better than the defenders. Their panzers, their infantry, their artillery, they were all talking. They were coordinating, and the Americans were deaf. This is where Corporal Eddie Voss comes in. Eddie Voss wasn't supposed to be a hero. He wasn't supposed to be listening at all. He was the son of German immigrants who had fled Europe in 1923, settling in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Until Pearl Harbor, German was the language of his home. He learned it at his grandmother's knee. But he didn't just learn the words. He learned the rhythms. He learned the subtle difference between a Prussian dialect and a Bavarian one. He learned the idioms, the slang, the music of the language. But Eddie had another, stranger gift. A gift for patterns. Before the war, he worked for the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company. His job was troubleshooting. When electrical systems failed, Eddie wouldn't just look at the schematics. He would listen. He would listen to the hum of the transformers. He'd put his ear to a circuit breaker. He told his superiors that equipment had personalities. He could hear a slight change in a transformer's rhythm days before it failed. He could diagnose a fault by the personality of the static it made. His bosses thought he was eccentric, but he was never wrong. When he enlisted in 1943, the Army tested his German. They marked him fluent and assigned him to signals intelligence. But this wasn't a spy movie. There was no cozy desk job in London, translating intercepts through some bureaucratic mix-up, some officer looking at the wrong line on a spreadsheet. Eddie was assigned to the 101st Airborne as a field radio operator. His gift was ignored. His job was to fix equipment, relay coordinates, and maintain communication lines. He spent most of 1944 cold, wet, and bored. Until the bulge. When Hitler's offensive shattered the lines, Eddie found himself in that frozen foxhole outside Bastogne. His unit was cut off. His orders were simple: stay alive and keep the radio warm. He had his standard-issue SCR 300 radio, and he had a pair of high-quality headphones, scavenged from a destroyed German STKKF's 251 half-track, and he had nothing but time. So, he did what he had always done. He started listening. The U.S. Army Signal Corps had strict protocols. Rule number 1. Operators were forbidden from monitoring enemy frequencies. Forbidden. The reasons were practical. First, it wasted time. Second, it risked operators being fed disinformation. And third, it could lead to unauthorized responses that compromised operational security. Eddie Voss heard those rules, and he broke them. He spun the dial. He moved past the American static, past the silence, and into the German spectrum. At first, it was just curiosity, fragments of chatter, requesting ammunition, Sector 4B. Adjust fire, 200 meters north. Move the column, move the column. Just voices in the dark, men speaking his grandmother's language while trying to kill his friends. But then, Eddie's real gift kicked in, the gift from the power company. He wasn't just hearing voices. He was hearing patterns. He grabbed a notebook and a pencil. He sketched crude maps based on unit designations. He logged transmission times, frequencies, call signs, and just like the transformers in Milwaukee, he started hearing personalities. There was an artillery spotter who pronounced Feuer, fire, with a slight, almost imperceptible lisp. There was a logistics officer who ended every transmission with end in the same bored monotone. And there was a panzer commander. Eddie's pencil hovered over the page. This one was different. His call sign was Eisenfaust Veer, Iron Fist 4. The voice was a low rasp, a smoker's voice. The man was cautious, methodical. Eddie kept listening to Iron Fist 4. For 1 day. Then 2. He barely slept. He just listened and he wrote. Within 48 hours, Eddie knew this man. He knew this commander was operating northeast of Bastogne. He knew his fuel situation was critical, and he knew why the commander was so cautious. On the second night, Eddie heard a furious exchange. It was Iron Fist 4, the man Eddie had started to call Klaus in his notes. Klaus was arguing with his own command. He wasn't insubordinate. He was professional. But he was furious. Klaus was refusing to move his column down a new route until it was cleared by engineers. He kept repeating, "Zwei Panzer verloren. Nicht wieder. 2 tanks lost. Not again." Eddie's blood ran cold. Klaus wasn't just cautious. He was traumatized. He had lost 2 tanks, 2 full crews, to American minefields in the past week. He had driven his men into a trap based on bad intelligence, and he was never going to let it happen again. This is a critical moment. Eddie realized something about German radio discipline. The Wehrmacht's communication doctrine was rigid, hierarchical, terrifyingly efficient. Normally, but this wasn't normal. This was the bulge. The Germans were exhausted. Their equipment was failing, and in their desperation to keep moving, they had started cutting corners. They weren't using proper code sequences to authenticate transmissions. There wasn't time. Instead, they relied on recognition, on familiarity, on knowing their officers' voices, on the familiar cadence of orders. It was faster. It was practical, and as Eddie Voss sat in his foxhole, he realized it was a catastrophic vulnerability. Klaus, the man who had lost 2 tanks, the man who was terrified of mines, would question orders from an unfamiliar voice. He would demand confirmation. But what if an order came through that sounded exactly like his superiors? What if that order confirmed his deepest fears? What if it promised him safety from the very thing he dreaded most? Eddie understood something about psychology that the army didn't teach. Suspicious people aren't suspicious of everything. They are suspicious of anomalies, things that don't fit the pattern. But if you match the pattern perfectly, if you sound exactly like what they expect to hear, suspicion never triggers. The brain simply accepts the familiar and moves on. Eddie Voss now knew how to talk to Klaus. He knew his call sign. He knew his frequency. He knew his fear. He was holding a psychological key. The ethical weight of what he was considering was crushing. This wasn't war. This was impersonation. He wouldn't just be breaking army regulations. He'd be engaging in psychological warfare, alone, without authorization. If he was caught, if the Germans detected the deception and triangulated his position, they would rain artillery on his foxhole until there was nothing left but a smoking crater. But worse than that, he'd be deceiving a man he'd come to understand, maybe even respect. Klaus was the enemy. Klaus would kill Americans, but Klaus was also a human being, a professional soldier, traumatized by loss, just trying to do his job and keep his men alive. And Eddie was now planning to weaponize that man's trauma to send him and his entire battalion to their deaths. Eddie stared at his notes as the snow fell thicker, muffling the world. The moral calculation was simple, and it was horrible. Klaus and his 40 tanks versus 300 sleeping American infantrymen. There was no good choice. There was only the choice that saved the most lives on his side. He started running scenarios in his head. How would he get the right accent? His grandmother's German was working class. Klaus's commanders, they sounded different. Aristocratic, Prussian, clipped consonants. Absolute certainty. He began whispering into the frozen air, practicing. Eisenfaust 4, hier, Oberkommando. No, that wasn't right. The pitch was wrong. Eisenfaust 4, here, Panzergruppe Kommando, closer. He had to become a Prussian general. He was so deep in his planning, so lost in the static. So use TD. He didn't hear the boots crunching in the snow behind him. Corporal! Eddie's head snapped up. The man standing at the edge of his foxhole wasn't from his unit. He was an officer, flanked by 2 armed MPs. Snow gathered on his shoulders. He held out his hand. Give me the headset, Corporal. It was Captain Morrison. Eddie's stomach dropped. He pulled the headphones off slowly, the German voices still crackling faintly. Sir, I can explain. You've been monitoring enemy frequencies without authorization for 4 days. Morrison's voice was flat, controlled. The kind of control that comes before an explosion. You've filled notebooks with intelligence you have no clearance to collect, and you've been using a captured enemy radio set without reporting it to command. One of the MPs climbed down into the foxhole. He didn't speak. He just began disconnecting Eddie's equipment. The SCR 300 went first, then the captured German headphones, and then the MP reached for the notebook. No, sir, please. Eddie watched his work, his patterns, his maps, Klause, disappear into an equipment bag. It felt like they were dismantling his brain. Sir, you don't understand. There's a Panzer column. Call sein Eisenfaust 4. I understand perfectly, Corporal. Morrison cut him off, his voice like ice. You're a radio operator. You are not an intelligence analyst. We have trained personnel for this. But they're moving. Tonight, on the fuel depot west of here, there are 300 men sleeping there. Enough! Morrison's jaw tightened. Do you have any idea how many false reports intelligence gets every day? Every private who speaks a little high school German thinks he's cracked the Enigma code from a damn foxhole. This isn't false, sir. I've been tracking him for days. I know his voice. I know his fears. You've been listening to radio chatter you are not trained to interpret, Morrison said, gesturing to the MP who was now collecting the captured German radio. For all you know, Corporal, you've been listening to a deception operation. The Germans know we monitor their frequencies. They feed us disinformation constantly. Eddie felt something breaking inside him. Not anger, something colder. The realization that Morrison wasn't listening. He wasn't going to check. He wasn't going to do anything except follow protocol. Sir, please, just verify it. Send a runner to the depot. Tell them to expect contact. That's all I'm asking. Morrison studied Eddie for a long, terrible moment. When he spoke, his voice was almost gentle, which was worse. Voss, you're a good radio operator. You've kept our comms running under impossible conditions. But you crossed a line, a serious line. You will cease all monitoring of enemy frequencies, immediately. You will not discuss your unauthorized intelligence with anyone. And if I hear you've so much as touched enemy equipment again, I will have you court-martialed. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. The words tasted like ash. Good. Morrison stood up. Get some sleep. You look like hell. The captain turned and climbed out of the foxhole. The MPs followed, carrying Eddie's entire world in their bags. Eddie sat in the sudden, agonizing silence. The German radio was gone. His notes were gone. His ability to monitor Klause was gone. And somewhere out in the darkness, 40 German tanks were fueling up, preparing to roll over 300 sleeping Americans. He tried to tell himself it was over. He tried to believe Morrison would follow up, that the system would work. But he'd been in the army long enough to know better. Morrison would file a report. That report would be added to a stack. Intelligence would prioritize threats based on source reliability, and an unauthorized corporal's warning would rank somewhere below 0. The snow fell harder, turning the world into a gray, hopeless void. He pulled his coat tighter. There had to be a way, some proper channel. And that's when he heard it. Voices, drifting from a supply trench 30 yards away. 2 officers, walking fast, their voices carrying on the cold night air, pulled every available man for the defense perimeter. That fuel depot's practically empty now. Smart. If the Germans break through, better to have the men than the diesel. Assuming the Germans even know where it is. That sector's been quiet for days. The voices faded. Eddie sat perfectly still. The fuel depot wasn't just undefended. It had been deliberately stripped of its men. Command had gambled. They had bet 300 lives that the Germans didn't know its location. But Klause knew. Eddie had heard the orders himself, and in approximately 4 hours, Klause would receive his final orders, and 40 Panzer tanks would turn west. He looked at the corner of his foxhole, where the captured German radio had been. It was gone, confiscated, locked away, but not destroyed. Eddie Voss had never stolen anything in his life. He had never disobeyed a direct order. But sitting in that frozen hole, knowing what he knew, he realized his entire life. The German grandmother, the transformers in Milwaukee, the bureaucratic mix-up. It had all been preparing him for this moment. He pulls his helmet on, checks his bayonet, and slowly, quietly, climbs out of his foxhole. He vanishes into the blizzard. The supply depot was a collection of canvas tents and wooden crates, arranged in what optimistic planners called organization. But to Eddie, the troubleshooter from Milwaukee, it was just another system, a system with patterns. He moved between the shadows, a ghost in the blizzard. His breath formed small clouds that vanished in the falling snow. He wasn't a commando. He was a radio operator. He was cold, he was terrified, and he was moving on pure cold rage. He knew which paths the sentries walked. He knew which tents held ammunition and which held equipment awaiting intelligence review. The captured German radio would be in the CI tent, counterintelligence, a glorified storage area where confiscated enemy equipment sat, waiting for someone with the proper clearance to tag it, catalog it, and ship it to London or Washington. The tent was guarded, but not heavily. Who would steal a broken German radio in the middle of a war? Eddie crouched behind a stack of frozen supply crates, his eyes fixed on the guard. A young kid, probably 19, stamping his feet against the cold, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Eddie didn't watch the guard. He watched the pattern. The kid was cold. He was miserable, and he was predictable. He would stand at the tent flap for 30 seconds, then turn and walk 10 paces to his right, to the corner of the next tent, just to feel the illusion of movement, of warmth. He'd stay there for 10 seconds, then walk back, a 40-second cycle, 10 seconds of which the tent flap was unwatched. 10 seconds was an eternity. Eddie waited for the turn. The moment the guard's back was to him, he moved. He didn't run, he glided. 3 long steps across the snow. He slipped under the tent flap and was inside. He was in organized chaos. Luger pistols, binoculars, German helmets, stacks of maps, all tagged. And in the corner, just as he'd expected, was the equipment bag the MPs had taken. He grabbed it. It felt heavy. The radio was inside, but his notes. His notebook wasn't in the bag. Panic surged in his throat. The radio was useless without the notes, the frequencies, the call signs, the patterns. Klause's voice. He scanned the tent. It was dark, lit only by a single low-watt bulb on a field desk. And there, on the desk, weighted down by a coffee mug, was his notebook. On top of it was a small typed tag. Eddie squinted to read it. Unauthorized intelligence. To be forwarded to G2 for review. Source, CPL, Voss, E. They hadn't even dismissed it. They were studying it. He snatched the notebook. He was out of the tent in 2 seconds. The guard was just beginning his turn back toward the flap. He never saw the shadow that slipped back into the blizzard. Back in his foxhole, Eddie's hands shook so violently he could barely reconnect the radio. He was breathing in gasps. He had just committed a dozen court-martial offenses: theft of evidence, insubordination, breaking confinement to quarters. He didn't care. He checked the radio. The German engineering was solid. It was still functional. He looked at the battery, and his heart sank. The power level was low, critically low. He had maybe 2 hours of transmission time, maybe less in the freezing cold. He had one shot at this. If the battery died mid-transmission, if he was cut off, Klause would know. The Germans would know. They would triangulate the partial broadcast, and this foxhole would become a crater. One shot. Eddie opened his precious notebook. His hands, smeared with frozen mud, turned the pages. There it was. Frequency, 43.4 megahertz. The Standardpanzergruppe command channel. Call sign, Eisenfaust 4. Scheduled check-in. 2:30 hours. His watch, 02.03 hours. He had less than 30 minutes to get on the air, broadcast his fake orders, have Klause acknowledge them, and get off the air before the real German command tried to call. He was in a race against his own army, and the German one. Now, the performance. He couldn't just speak German. He had to become the enemy. He closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to slow. He pictured the voices he'd heard, not Klause. Klause was the target. He had to become Klause's superior. He remembered the voice from 2 nights ago, the one who gave Klause the bad intelligence about the minefields. The voice was sharp, aristocratic, a Prussian accent. The man spoke with the absolute bored certainty of a man who had never been questioned in his life. Eddie whispered into the darkness of his foxhole, practicing. Eisenfaust 4. Here, Panzergruppe Kommando. He stopped. No, that was his voice. That was Milwaukee German. It was nice. The commander's voice wasn't nice. It was a weapon. It was clipped. The vowels were short. He tried again, pitching his voice lower, forcing the air from his diaphragm. Eisenfaust 4. Here. Commando. Closer. He had to sound bored, annoyed even, as if this was a distraction from more important matters. The way an aristocrat speaks to a mechanic. He practiced the phrases over and over. Neue Befehle. New orders. Route ist kompromittiert. Route is compromised. Sofort ausführen. Execute immediately. He felt the words change his mouth, his throat. He wasn't Eddie Voss, the troubleshooter. He was Oberst von somebody. A man who sent tanks to their death as easily as signing a dinner receipt. Finally, the lie. He couldn't just tell Klause to stop. That would be suspicious. He had to redirect him. He had to use Klause's trauma. He looked at his notes, at the crude map he had sketched. He remembered radio chatter from 3 days ago, a quiet sector, northeast of his position. The Americans had laid a massive anti-tank minefield there, a defensive field, and then pulled back. The Germans hadn't contested the ground because it was useless. It led nowhere. But Klause didn't know that. Eddie planned the lie. It was brilliant. It was simple. It was diabolical. He wouldn't just tell Klause to avoid a minefield. He would tell him his current route, the one to the fuel depot, was the minefield, and that he, the all-knowing commander, was saving him by diverting him to a new, safe route, a safe route that would send Klause's entire battalion directly into the real, forgotten American minefield. He checked his watch. 02.16 hours. It was time. His hand was shaking as he reached for the transmitter. This was it. The moral calculation was over. He was about to play God. He was about to sentence a man he respected to a horrific death, to save men who would never even know his name. His finger pressed the transmit switch. In the silence of the foxhole, The click of the German mechanism sounded as loud as a gunshot. He waited for the red light to glow. It did. He opened his mouth and became someone else entirely. Eisenfaust 4. Hier Panzergruppe Kommando. Melden Sie sich. Iron Fist 4. This is Tank Group Command. Report in. His voice. It wasn't his. It was the Prussians. It was cold, sharp, and full of authority. He released the switch. Silence. Nothing but the faint hiss of static. His heart hammered against his ribs. He waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Did he get the frequency wrong? Was the battery already dead? Was Klause not monitoring? Did he? Hier. Eisenfaust 4. Empfangsbereit. This is Iron Fist 4. Ready to receive. The voice. The smoker's rasp. It was him. It was Klause. Eddie nearly dropped the microphone in relief. He forced himself to wait. He counted. 1, 2, 3. A commander doesn't rush. A commander is in control. He pressed the transmit button again. Eisenfaust 4. Neue Befehle. Iron Fist 4. New orders. Ihr aktueller Angriffsweg. Code Ernte is kompromittiert. Your current attack route, Code Harvest, is compromised. He released the button. The response was almost immediate. And it was full of confusion. Kompromittiert? Verstehe nicht. Wir sind bereit. Compromised? I do not understand. We are ready. Klause was questioning. This was the moment. The inflection point. Eddie's entire plan. The lives of 300 men rested on this next sentence. He had to sell the lie. He had to use the key. He pressed the switch. He let impatience and anger flow into his voice. Schweigen Sie. Hören Sie zu. Silence. Listen. Luftaufklärung, aerial reconnaissance, has identified significant American minefields along your designated route. Sector Hartmann, it is a trap. I repeat, your route is a trap. He released. A long, agonizing silence. He could hear Klause breathing on the other end of the radio. He could feel the man's mind flashing back to his 2 lost tanks, to the fires, to the screams, the trauma Eddie had identified. He was now stabbing it. The silence stretched for 7 seconds. 8. 9. Verstanden. Understood. The voice was tight. All business. The suspicion was gone, replaced by the cold dread of a man whose worst fears had just been confirmed. Die Route. Ist vermint. The route is mined. Eddie let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He bought it. Klause's next words were exactly what Eddie expected. Befehle? Neue Route bitte. Orders? New route, please. Now, the kill. Eddie picked up his notebook, his hand steady now. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, terrible focus. He read the fake coordinates, the ones that led to the field of Teller mines. Neue Route ist sicherer Pass. Referenzpunkt 035. Folgen Sie Gitter 884. New route is safe pass, reference point 035. Follow grid 884. And then the masterstroke. Die Route ist von Pionieren als sauber bestätigt. The route is confirmed clean by engineers. He had given Klause the one thing he craved more than victory: permission to feel safe. There was a pause as Klause presumably copied the coordinates. Then, one last question. Was ist das neue Ziel? What is the new target? Eddie had prepared for this. He couldn't just send him into an empty field. It had to be a Mission. Ein leicht verteidigter amerikanischer Versorgungskonvoi. Ein Gelegenheitsziel. A lightly defended American supply convoy. An opportunity target. Nach Einnahme des Ziels Position halten, warten Sie auf weitere Befehle. Ende. After taking the target, hold position. Await further orders. End. The beauty of the lie was its modesty. He wasn't promising Klause a glorious victory, just a minor, believable, tactical objective. something that wouldn't trigger his suspicion. The reply came back, crisp and professional. Klause was a good soldier. He was a beaten soldier. Verstanden. Route sicherer Pass. Ziel Versorgungskolonne. Eisenfaust 4. Wird Befehl ausführen. Geschätzte Ankunft 05:30. Ende. Understood. Route safe pass. Target supply column. Iron Fist 4. Will execute order. Estimated arrival 05:30. End. The static hissed. Eddie released the transmit button. He didn't move. He just sat in the absolute crushing silence. His entire body began to shake. A violent, uncontrollable tremor. Adrenaline flooded his system in sickening waves. He'd done it. Klaus had accepted the orders. In approximately 3 hours, 40 German tanks would roll confidently, safely, into American minefields. Believing they were flanking an ambush, Eddie didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. He had just sentenced men to death. Klause would die. His crews would die. They would die, never knowing they'd been deceived by a corporal in a frozen foxhole. He moved quickly, his hands numb. He buried the German radio deep under the mud and loose dirt in the corner of his foxhole. He buried the notebook with it. He covered the spot, camouflaging it, making it look like it had never been disturbed. His life, his entire future, now depended on no one ever digging in that corner. He sat back, exhausted, and looked at his watch. 2:02 to 24 hours, and that's when a new, colder, worse fear hit him. Klaus's real commanders, the real Panzergruppe Kommando, were scheduled to make their real call at 02:30 hours, in 6 minutes. What would happen when they called? And Klause didn't answer? Or worse, what if Klause did answer and told them he couldn't because he was already executing other orders? Eddie realized the deception wasn't over. It had just entered a new, terrifying phase. He wasn't just hiding from his own army. He was now hiding from the German one. Eddie sat in the dark. His watch read 02:25 hours. In 5 minutes, the real Panzergruppe Kommando would try to contact Klause. He was now completely, terrifyingly blind. The German radio was buried under 2 feet of frozen mud. He couldn't listen. He couldn't transmit. He couldn't do anything but sit and wait and wonder if his entire deception was about to collapse. He pictured the scene. Somewhere, miles away, in a German command post, a radio operator was getting ready. He was checking his frequencies. He was looking at his own watch. Eddie's deception rested on one simple, terrifying hope: that the Germans would assume radio failure, not a ghost. At 02:30 hours, exactly on schedule, that German operator keyed his transmitter. Eisenfaust 4. Here, Kommando. Melden Sie sich. Iron Fist 4. This is command. Report in. Silence. Nothing but the hiss of the cold night. The operator tried again, his voice a little louder, a little more annoyed. Eisenfaust 4. Kommando. Bestätigen Sie. Iron Fist 4. Command. Confirm. Silence. The operator turned to his superior, a major who was hunched over a map. Sir, Iron Fist 4 is not responding. The major didn't look up. He's probably just having trouble with the equipment. This cold. It's hell on the batteries. Try the alternate frequency. The operator switched frequencies. He called again. And again. Now, the major looked up, his brow furrowed. This wasn't like Klause. Klause was a professional. He always responded. Is it jamming? The major asked. No, sir, the operator replied. The frequency is clear. He's just not there. A cold dread began to seep into the German command post. Had Klause been ambushed before the attack? Had the Americans launched a surprise assault? But the lines were quiet. They tried for 30 minutes. They called his call sign over and over, their transmissions growing more and more desperate. But they were calling into a void. Klause wasn't answering, because Klause was in radio silence. He was a good soldier, executing what he believed were legitimate orders, driving his 40 tanks through the snow toward a safe pass and an easy target. He would never know his own command was screaming for him. Finally, the German major slammed his fist on the table. He's gone. Either captured or his radio is destroyed. We have to assume the attack on the fuel depot is a failure. The German command, completely blind, scrambled to readjust their plans, never knowing that their own battalion was, at that very moment, still rolling toward its doom, led there by a voice that had already vanished. Eddie Voss knew none of this. He sat in his foxhole, shaking, as 3 hours, the 3 longest hours of his life, crawled by. He was in an agony of uncertainty. Did the deception work? Did Klause turn back? Did the real command reach him? Did the battery die mid-call? Had he doomed 300 Americans? And Klause's battalion? For nothing? He stared into the darkness, in the direction of the safe pass. The time was 05:32 hours. It started not as a sound, but as a feeling, a low-frequency thump that he felt in his chest, a vibration through the frozen earth. Then, the sound, a deep, ripping boom that echoed across the hills, a flash of orange light on the horizon, northeast, exactly where he had sent them. A second explosion, a third, then a fourth, fifth, and sixth, a cascading chain of detonations, fountains of orange and white fire, as 40 tons of German steel, fuel, and ammunition began to tear themselves apart. 2 miles west, the 300 American soldiers at the fuel depot were thrown from their sleep. They grabbed their rifles. They manned their positions. They stared into the darkness, waiting for the panzers that Eddie had heard on the radio. They prepared for an assault that never came. The explosions rolled across the Ardennes for 20 minutes. Secondary detonations, ammunition cooking off, a funeral pyre for an entire battalion. Eddie sat in his foxhole and listened to the echoes die. He didn't feel relief. He didn't feel pride. He felt the crushing, absolute weight of what he had done. He pictured Klause's final moment, the smoker's rasp. Silenced forever, Klause died instantly. His command tank triggered a teller mine that punched through the thin belly armor and ignited the fuel tanks in a fraction of a second. He never knew he'd been deceived. He never knew the orders came from an American foxhole. In his final fiery moment, Klause believed he was executing a legitimate tactical maneuver to avoid a trap that didn't exist. 23 other German tank crew members died in those first 30 seconds. More would die in the hours that followed, as American artillery, alerted by the massive, unexplained explosions, began to rain fire on the trapped, burning column. By dawn, the Eisenfaust Wehr Battalion had been effectively destroyed, annihilated, not by superior American tactics, not by overwhelming firepower, but by a single unauthorized voice that had turned a man's trauma into a weapon. At first light, American reconnaissance patrols were sent to investigate the unauthorized engagement. What they found was a graveyard. The patrol leader, a young lieutenant, radioed back to headquarters, his voice shaking. "Sir, I'm at the coordinates. The tanks! They're here. The entire column. It's gone. Wiped out." There was a pause. "But sir, there's nothing here. No American positions. No anti-tank guns, no bodies. They're just in the minefield. They just drove straight in, as if they were ordered to." The intelligence reports that followed were confused, contradictory, and bordered on hysteria. How had a full panzer battalion, commanded by a veteran, driven directly into a known American minefield? A minefield that wasn't even defending anything? Some analysts suggested a radio malfunction. Others proposed the German commander had suffered a complete mental breakdown. One report even suggested a mass coordinated suicide. The true explanation was impossible. It never appeared in any official document. The United States Army simply could not explain what had happened. 3 hours after dawn, Eddie was in his foxhole, cleaning his rifle, his movements stiff, his mind numb. He was just a corporal again. He heard the crunch of boots in the snow. He looked up. It was Captain Morrison. He wasn't carrying a sidearm. He wasn't flanked by MPs. He was alone. He was holding a single, small, typed piece of paper. The tag from the CI tent. Morrison climbed down into the foxhole and sat across from Eddie, the silence stretching between them. Finally, the captain spoke. His voice was low. Intelligence found something interesting. This morning, Corporal. Eddie met his gaze. He said nothing. A German panzer column, completely destroyed. In the minefield northeast of here, exactly where your notes said that minefield was. Morrison paused, his eyes locked on Eddie's. But they weren't supposed to be there, were they? They were supposed to be 2 miles west, attacking the fuel depot. Eddie's face was a mask of cold exhaustion. The German radio we confiscated, Morrison continued, his voice barely a whisper. It's missing from the CI tent. Disappeared around 0130 hours. The guard, he didn't see a thing. The notebook was taken too. A long, agonizing pause. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Corporal? Eddie looked at his captain. No, sir. Morrison stared at him, searching his face. He saw no fear, no pride, just the hollowed-out look of a man who had seen too much. Morrison knew. Eddie knew that he knew. And in that moment, Eddie realized the captain was trapped. He couldn't court-martial the man who had just saved 300 lives, maybe more. But he couldn't ever admit what had happened. To admit that a corporal was right, and that command was wrong. To admit that a single soldier had broken every rule, and succeeded. It would shatter the very system Morrison had sworn to uphold. Morrison looked down at the small paper tag in his glove. What you did, if you did it, was completely unauthorized. It was the most reckless, insubordinate act I have ever witnessed. You impersonated enemy command. If the Germans had detected you, you'd be dead. This entire position would be a crater. That's not heroism, Voss. That's a catastrophe. That just happened to work. Yes, sir, Eddie said. But Morrison sighed, the anger draining out of him, replaced by something else. Intelligence is calling it the most successful psychological operation of the Battle of the Bulge. They are very confused as to who to give the credit to. Morrison looked at the tag. Unauthorized intelligence. Source, CPL. Voss, E. He slowly, deliberately tore the small paper tag in half, then in quarters. He let the pieces fall into the snow. I am writing a report, Morrison said, standing up. It will state that the German column was likely deceived by a classified high-level Allied broadcast operation. Source, unknown. I am recommending you for a commendation. For your initial courageous intelligence gathering. He paused, brushing snow from his uniform. I am also transferring you, effective immediately, a signals unit, in Luxembourg. You will be far from the front lines. You will never go near enemy radio equipment again. Do you understand me? Yes, sir, Eddie said. Morrison climbed out of the foxhole. He stopped and turned back one last time. Voss, those 300 men who woke up alive this morning, they will never know your name. There won't be any medals for this. No parades. This, what really happened, will never appear in any official history. It cannot. He looked hard at Eddie. Can you live with that? Eddie thought about Klausa. He thought about the smoker's rasp he would never hear again. He thought about the men who died believing a lie. I can live with it, sir. Morrison nodded once. Good, because no one else will ever know. He turned and disappeared into the morning light. Eddie Voss spent the rest of the war in Luxembourg, maintaining communication equipment and training new radio operators. He never told a soul what happened in that Belgian foxhole. After the war, he returned to Milwaukee. He married. He raised 3 children. He went back to work for the power company. The man with the golden ear, who could hear problems in transformers. He died in 1987 at the age of 64. His family, his friends, his co-workers, they all believed he was just a simple radio repairman who had done his duty. But the story didn't die. It was just scattered. In 1992, a German military historian was interviewing survivors of the Ardennes offensive. He spoke to an old Wehrmacht officer, a former major, who had been haunted for nearly 50 years by the ghost of Eisenfaust Wehr. The major told the historian, "He just vanished. We tried to call. He was gone. We assumed an ambush. We assumed radio failure, but the Americans, they never attacked the fuel depot. It was quiet. It never made sense." He told him the strangest part. When the wreckage was finally analyzed, the Germans discovered the battalion had been destroyed in a minefield 3 kilometers off their assigned route. The old major said, "It was as if they were led there by a ghost, by a voice that came from nowhere and sent them all to hell." The historian, intrigued, began digging through declassified American reports. He found Captain Morrison's after-action report. German column destroyed, likely deceived by unknown PSYOP broadcast. He found a small commendation for a Corporal Eddie Voss, for superior intelligence gathering that had saved American lives. But the historian could never find the link. The file on Voss's unauthorized activity, the missing radio, the stolen notebook. It was gone, buried, sanitized, just as Morrison had promised. The truth remained broken, in a dozen different files, in 2 different languages, hidden in a frozen foxhole, in a voice that spoke perfect German into the static. Eddie Voss never fired a shot in combat, but on one frozen December night, he fought the most important battle of his life. He was armed with nothing but a captured radio, 4 days of observation, and the courage to become the enemy long enough to save his friends. In the end, war isn't always won by those who follow orders. Sometimes, it's won by those who understand when to break them. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold tales of World War II's invisible heroes. Because sometimes, the most important battles are the ones that were never supposed to be recorded.